we have our conference keynote, who is Maddie Stone. Maddie Stone is a security researcher and leads the exploits team within Google's Threat Analysis Group, or TAG as it's known as. For the past 4 years, she's focused on 0 days that are actively exploited in the wild, first at Google Project Zero and now TAG. She has found vulnerabilities in many major platforms, including Safari, Chrome, Android, and Windows. Previously, she was a reverse engineer focused on malware on the Android security team. We are very privileged to have her today. So let's welcome Maddie to the stage.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all so much for having me. The last time I presented at an Australian conference, I was at home in San Francisco presenting to a computer screen while y'all were all in a room together. So I'm so thankful to Silvio and Kylie for inviting me back so we can do this the right way and I can get to meet all of y'all. So when they invited me to Keynote, it felt like a lot of pressure of coming up with a topic because, as I've heard, this is the best technical security conference in all of Australia. So I was going back and forth and trying to think about what do I really enjoy when I'm listening to a keynote. And it's when folks are talking about things they care about, that they think are interesting. And so I'm trying that here, thinking about the things that when I get to sit down and have a coffee or a beer with someone and talk all about exploits, what they might find, or tell me they find at least, interesting, and some of the nuances associated with these when they had thought maybe it was pretty clear and there wasn't so much nuance in some of the areas. So let me know what you think once I'm back off the continent and in the US. You can hold it till there. But yeah, let's get into it. So they already gave me a very nice bio, but hi, I'm Maddie, and I really, really like zero-day exploits. And so I lead this team now called TAG Exploits. As a little team, we've only actually been set up officially within TAG for the last 3 months. But myself over on Project Zero, as well as TAG, has been focused on tracking, detecting commercial surveillance vendors, and understanding as much as we can about the active use of in the wild 0 days. So see, these are some of the recent blogs we've put up for TAG, and yeah. So this is, if we will talk about later why I think CVEs are a terrible metric for just about every little thing you can think of. But since there are some folks who I know are like, where's your CVE? How do I know that you're qualified? Our team just in 2023 has found 16 in the wild 0 days. 13 of these 16 are attributed or we found used by the commercial surveillance vendors. When I talk about commercial surveillance vendors, those are the folks like NSO and their Pegasus spyware, Candiru, Intellexa, etc. So they're the folks selling to governments some sort of spyware capability that is almost always using 0 days to get surreptitiously onto a device. So my goal with this is to hopefully make this a bit interesting for everyone, whether or not you've ever looked or thought about an exploit in your life, or you've been looking at this stuff for decades. And so let's start with, what does a modern exploit chain look like today? It's almost always going to actually include 3 different 0 days if someone wants to remotely target a mobile device, for example. You're always going to need your initial remote code execution. You're then, with that initial remote code execution, usually going to be caught in some sort of tight sandbox. Sandbox meaning you can't access a lot of data outside of that. You know, think about any app you install on your phone. You really don't want it, and it shouldn't be able to read your WhatsApp or Signal messages. That's the sandbox. So you first need to get out of that sandbox, and then you need likely a privilege escalation to get root or full privileges onto the device, because you want your spyware to do just about everything. So these are sort of the levels of it, and it's not ever just one 0 day anymore. And so when we think about that, we also need to remember that attackers are lazy, just like me and others, I hope, in this industry, of only ever wanting to do what's actually required to accomplish their goal. And so I think this is an important context for us all to remember when we see numbers of 0 days or folks talking about the threat of this versus they used to just be able to do phishing, et cetera, is yeah, if phishing's not working anymore, they're going to move to the next sophisticated level. And but if they don't need 0 days and instead can use phishing, they're going to use phishing. So I think we need to remember that actually we want attackers to have to use the most sophisticated means. We want to make them have to hack us with their most sophisticated capabilities. Because what's that story? We're never going to be able to say, or I hope you're not saying, I'm unhackable, no one can ever hack me with a 0 day. The other story can be is, we were breached, but they had to chain 4 of their best and novel 0 days together, and oh, by the way, we detected them in 24 hours. So you want attackers thinking of, do I really want to burn all these capabilities? This is the amount of energy and attention I have to put into this. So this is some of that context that I want to put behind the conversations we're going to have throughout this. And so a lot of people tell me, yes, Maddie, 0 days are scary, there's a lot of it happening, but in the scheme of things, it is the smallest number of computer-based attacks. Why should I be worried about this when most orgs are still falling vulnerable to attacks, or we're not getting things patched quickly, so an end day works perfectly fine? And the issue and why I hope lots of folks care, and yes, security hygiene, orgs do not need to be worried about protecting themselves from a 0 day if they're still taking 6 months to patch something, for example. But each of these 0 days has an outsized impact on society each time they're used. Because even if we specifically are not the ones being targeted with the 0 day, it affects us. If your journalists are being targeted, human rights defenders, political opponents, if you can't trust your elections, if journalists are scared to publish because of the threat of what's happening to them and their families, that does affect us all. And so that's why I hope folks understand that this is not just a them problem. I'm not a high-risk user. My organization is not going to be targeted specifically by these 0 days, so I don't need to be putting energy into also advocating for how vendors handle them, or sanctions against some of these commercial surveillance vendors, et cetera. So with all this in mind, we set up this brand new team 3 months ago within TAG, and we're working on setting up our mission. And so right now what we're working off of is detect, analyze, and prevent 0 day exploitation. And so our goal is find the attacks as soon as possible. That's a failure case when you detect it, so understand absolutely everything about them. And I mean failure case for attackers, not a failure case for us. And so we want to learn everything we can. What were the TTPs, techniques, tools, techniques, and procedures, and understand the details of that root cause vulnerability and how might they have found it, because they likely have others. What was that exploit technique? How were they delivering this? And use all of that information to figure out how do we make it so it can't happen again. And I have an asterisk here on 0 day. Because actually, this is one of the first places where it gets hard to describe exactly what you mean. It's supposed to be easy, right? A bug is either a 0 day or an end day. And, we have clear definitions, so it should just be one or the other. The definition I usually use is a 0 day is a vulnerability defenders don't yet know about. So the attackers know about it, but defenders don't. So that will mean that defenders aren't working to issue the patch, there's no patch to apply, there's not really, users don't even know they should be worried about it, etc. Which the opposite would be an end day, which is a bug that defenders do know about. So already we do get into some disagreements across the industry, with some folks using 0 day as a vulnerability that doesn't have a patch available, which, while slight modification, can be different and mean that you're categorizing things differently. But even with that, that should still be one or the other, right? But there ends up being quite a bit of confusion, especially when you're doing something like me and others of trying to track the number of actively exploited as a 0 day versus actively exploited as an end day things. And this starts to matter because it matters what you're trying to say. So let's go into an example. You go to the store and you buy this cute little product, and you choose them because you expect the vendor to be providing you security updates to keep you safe. And you trust, you've seen a record from that vendor and you're feeling good about it. They issue monthly security updates or whatever it is. But what you might not know is there's a cute little license library in there. There's a cute little open source kernel that doesn't issue CVEs because they expect you to sync back up to the kernel. And there's a cute little GPU driver which is not open source, so you don't see the source code, you just get patches or the binary blob. So what happens when there's vulnerabilities in those? What happens when, say, cute little GPU driver knows about a security fix, but it's in the binary blob, and you, as a user, haven't taken it? Or what about for the cute little kernel that is open source, but they have a policy of not issuing CVEs because they expect all fixes to be taken in? So you, as the downstream, know that there's been a lot of changes, but don't realize there's a security impact. Is that 0-day or in-day? And so we're running into especially this dichotomy a lot. Upstream, meaning the folks who are being included, they might release a fix, patch a vulnerability. But the downstream doesn't release a fix. And that means none of the users are able to actually install the patch on their phone. Other examples of this is, I said before, bug fixed upstream without a security advisory or CVE. Does downstream defenders even know that it's a bug, and where would that be 0-day or in-day? What about a product that doesn't or hasn't ever received security updates? Do they even have defenders? And thus, could it be a 0-day or an in-day if there's not even defenders or security updates being released? What about a bug that's fully disclosed? Maybe a security researcher has tried really hard to report it to the vendor, and they're finally at the point that they don't have any more energy trying to get the vendor to take it seriously or release a patch. So they fully disclose, and then that's exploited after it's fully disclosed. Well, defenders know about it, so is it 0-day or in-day? And finally, mitigation bypasses. It's amazing how much defense in depth is starting to happen of exploit mitigations. Something like even mark of the web on Windows might be one where if something's downloaded from the web, it has a little pop-up saying, hey, are you sure you want to execute or run this or open this? It's from the web. So if you get past that, is that a vulnerability or not? Because usually a vulnerability has to pass a security boundary, and mitigations aren't usually considered security boundaries. So this is just some of those gray areas that we're confronting regularly for those of us in this space. And it comes down to, and what I think I'm challenging myself to think about, and what I hope others think about too, is what am I trying to communicate when I do say 0-day versus in-day? Because there's a lot of different options of why someone may be using this. And if we actually think and try to come up with more specific language of what we're trying to say by saying it's a 0-day or in-day, maybe we can figure this out and collaborate more on this really big problem. So some of the examples might be, this is 0-day because users don't have a clear and easy recourse to protect themselves. Clear and easy being something like a patch. Maybe they don't even know that they're vulnerable and need to apply something. Or maybe you're trying to communicate that, hey, this was an attack that required significant expertise and resources and couldn't have been, cybercriminal group X, Y, and Z. Maybe you're trying to say there should be urgency around this, or it's a bug defenders didn't know exists, the definition I usually use. So that's where it comes down to each of these gray areas of trying to think of why does it matter whether or not it's 0-day or in-day. So one of the ones on the common, upstream releases a patch, downstream hasn't. The way I've been trying to describe that to folks is that it's an in-day that functions like a 0-day. So we're still trying to fight against that because it's a signal for us of what attackers are able to do. But trying to be very clear that this is what we're trying to say. They didn't have to use a 0-day, but it's going to work towards users as one. And so that's a problem that we can then address specifically rather than just saying in-day, 0-day, et cetera. And so this comes up a lot of we have this public tracking sheet where we try to track all of the publicly known in the wild 0 days. And so I get lots and lots of emails and messages of, why'd you include this? You shouldn't have included this. You should include this, etc. We do have a scope on the intro sheet explaining, because everyone has a scope, and we outline ours there. But so the other side of this is that by having a tracking spreadsheet, it makes it pretty easy for people to focus on number of in the wild 0 days. It's clear, it's calculable, it's a metric, and it makes bar graphs. You know, all the things that everyone wants when they're trying to quantify security. And so when you look at this bar graph, obviously the 20 to 21 jump was one of the biggest things that caught everyone's attention. And I do think one of the turning points of folks starting to pay more attention to in the wild 0 days. But unfortunately, everything I kept getting based on that jump and the spike was, oh my goodness, Maddie, everything's gone to crap. Security's terrible. Look at how many in the wild 0 days are used. But what people didn't realize, actually, was that that 20 to 21 jump was with Android and Apple began disclosing when something was in the wild. And so when we get into that, we will talk about that more, but then the same thing happened when focusing just on the numbers of then what happened to 21 to 22. Maddie, you told us that jump was because of detection and disclosure, so is the jump 21 to 22 because we didn't do as good of detection? So that's where we need to start looking at, what does the number of in the wild 0 days even mean? What can we take from it and what can't we take from it? The first sort of descriptor we need is that, unfortunately, I am not able to calculate, and maybe some of y'all are, but I am not able to calculate how many 0 days are actually actively exploited in the wild. The attackers are not calling me up and letting me know when they're going to start using a new one and things like that. So what we can actually calculate and track is the number of in the wild 0 days detected and disclosed in the wild. And that's a really important distinction because, as I said, of that 2020 to 2021 jump, changes in detection and disclosure is going to obviously impact the number of detected and disclosed in the wild 0 days. But even beyond that still, what do we take from this number? Because we are seeing fluctuations, we are tracking them. How do we think about this? My take, the number can't tell us much. It's a pretty terrible metric for security, but it is an indicator. And so taking a step back to think about, why do we do this work? What are we getting from even trying to track them if we can't use the number as a security metric? And so let me tell you how I think about this problem and what we're trying to accomplish. So the first 4 years of studying in the wild 0 days, I spent time on Google Project Zero. And Project Zero's mission specifically is make 0 day hard. And so obviously I bring pieces of that now into this work of, yeah, we want to make 0 day hard. But what does that even mean? So the first piece of it is increase the cost per 0 day. And as everyone has a question of, well, how much does a 0 day cost whenever I say that? And so that's going to bring me to a tangent. Wednesday, this little tweet popped up and started getting a lot of attention. A 0 day broker offering to pay up to $20 million for an iOS full chain and an Android full chain. And I have opinions. Because, well, one, I won't be able to get into all of my opinions here, so come find me at the party later and I will talk your ear off. But first, how did we get to 20 million for what? 3 bugs, 4 bugs, maybe? Other thing, it does say up to. No one's promising anything with an up to. But how did we even come up with this number? So this was posted Wednesday, September 27th. But you look back at their Twitter feed and, they previously said they would pay $2.5 million for iOS and Android full chains. And that was only 2 months ago. So when I'm talking about cost, I am not talking about how much a Twitter account claims that they will pay up to for a 0-day. Because as much as I would love to put that on my performance packet or something like that to say, oh yeah, in 2 months, we made the cost of a 0-day go up 10 times, or just under 10 times, I don't think anyone would believe me, because it's not true. A 0-day chain is not almost 10 times harder now in September than it was 2 months ago. So that's not the cost what we're talking about. And this is largely driven by supply, and anyone can tweet anything they want. But this does bring us to, how do these commercial surveillance work? How does selling exploits work? What are even these business dynamics? So back in August 2022, about a year ago, Intellexa, one of the big commercial surveillance vendors, had documents of one of their price proposals leak. And this was really insightful for us, not even so much about the number and the cost, but how they structure their product. And so I know this is super small, but what this basically says is they will deliver their product, a capability of via a one-click exploits, meaning they will deliver a link, and the target does have to click the link for it to occur for both Android and iOS. And they will maintain that capability for a year. So they guarantee to you that they will have these 0-day capabilities for 1 year. And if things get patched or versions change, they will continue with new capabilities. You also get the spyware implant, some of the analytics around how to communicate once the spyware implant's involved, et cetera. Training sessions, things like that. So that's for $8 million for your 1-year guarantee of capabilities for both iOS and Android. So this was the screenshot about the maintenance package saying they will continue to support. And this is going to come into play later as well, of remembering they're saying we've got 0 days for you for a full 12 months regardless of patches. This is just something I found interesting too, is if you want the implant to stay on the phone through reboots, persistence will cost you another little $3 million. And the basic package is you can exploit people within your home country with the previous one, but if you want 5 additional countries outside your own borders as the customer buying it, then it will cost another 1.2 mil. So just some interesting aspects of how this works. But let's end that tangent, sparkly hands, everything now. So what I do mean by cost of 0-day is not the cost to buy a 0-day, because that is going to be driven much more by demand. And as that tweet had said, its customer is a non-NATO country. And so depending on who you are, it may cost more. Depending on the restrictions you placed on it, it's going to be different. So that's not what we're trying to change with Make 0-day hard. We're trying to influence how much does it cost for someone to develop a 0-day. Of course, that will ultimately influence some of the cost to buy it as well, but what we're directly trying to change is those costs to develop. And that's not just money. That's also how long does it take you to find that new 0-day and develop an exploit technique to make it useful. How much expertise do you need the most senior folks and have a huge ramp-up time of getting up to speed on that component they're looking at? Do people need to be specialized on one, or could you have one person that can generally do everything for you? We want people to have to invest time and money and expertise to be able to develop these. That you can't just hire anyone off the street and have a new 0-day, within a month or so. So that's what we mean by increase the cost per 0-day, and secondarily, increase the number of 0-days required to maintain that same capability. So that can look a few different ways. First, we said they're guaranteeing they'll have that capability for a full year. If you're finding things really fast and they have to keep, oops, walked into the fog. If you're finding things really fast and they have to keep coming up with new 0-days to meet their contract, you're increasing the number of 0-days required. If vendors are creating new security boundaries such that as that little 3-bug chain that I showed at the beginning now is a 4 or 5 bug chain, that's increasing the number of 0-days required. So that's what we mean when we think about making zero-day, or specifically these sort of technical aspects of zero-day exploitation, harder. Ultimately, it costs them more for a less useful zero-day. But then I guess we were on a tangent of a tangent, so let's get back to, all that being said, what does the number of in the wild zero days mean? And I said it's nothing. It doesn't tell us much of anything about security, because there's a lot of reasons that are great for security that may drive the number both up and down. And there's a lot of things that are security regressions that will also cause that number to go up and down. So 3 security wins that would cause that number to spike. And I think these were some of the things that were really driving that jump from 2020 to 2021. More folks disclosing when there is a zero-day and it's known to be in the wild. Them not just being fixed as regular bugs, but Apple and Android annotating release notes saying there's evidence to suggest this is being exploited in the wild. Adding security boundaries, discovering and fixing those zero days more quickly. But at the same vein, there's reasons that number could go up and it not be great. Such as it's easier to have a functioning zero-day because no one's performing variant analysis. And so you only need to change 1 or 2 lines of code and have another functioning zero-day because, yeah, the vendor patched this specific bug in one place, but didn't patch it in any of the others. Exploit techniques aren't mitigated. As a part of our industry, thankfully we're now at this point where usually bugs will be fixed and there is the expectation that bugs are fixed. The same isn't said for exploit techniques, meaning just because you have a bug, you have to find a way to make that bug useful to accomplish your goal. And it is not the norm for all of those techniques to be mitigated each time one's found. So what that means is an attacker can plug and play a new vulnerability into their exploit technique framework. And lastly, the really, really sad one, more exploitable bugs are added to code than that are fixed. So going up really can't tell us much. And the same can be said for going down. You know, lots of these are opposites of what I just said, so I won't read them out again. But something of making it harder is, for example, killing off a whole bug class. So now for someone to find a bug, they have to get creative, come up with new bug classes, research a component that has no public research on it, things like that. Or it could go down because attackers don't need to use zero days, they can use end days or phishing. It could be going down because the same zero day has a super long life because patches aren't being released to users. So yeah, that number doesn't mean much. But it can be an indicator to tell us, hey, we need to look closer. Something here is changing, and what is it? So every year for the last 4 years, we've published year in review of In the Wild 0 days. And so we published our 2022, and we saw the big drop from 2021 to 2022. It went from, I believe, like 69 down to 40. So pretty substantial drop when we're not talking about big numbers here. 69, 40, those aren't huge in the scheme of every other security thing that we deal with in this industry. And so that's a pretty substantial drop down. But that's where that number of 0 days versus end date, or the definition, came in. Because what I did see when I broke it down further to see, was it one platform having a drop? Was it across the board? What are we dealing with that contributed to this drop? We saw that the number in Android dropped a lot. But then when we thought back of all the campaigns that were found, we realized quite a few of those campaigns used end days that were functioning like 0 days. So the attackers didn't have to use 0 days. So that's a negative reason for the numbers to come down. Negative being a security regression, something that an opportunity for us to fix. Another on the other side is we also saw a pretty distinct drop in browser 0 days from 2021 to 2022. And when we took a step back and thought about what could be contributing to that, there were 2 things. In 2022, most of the major browsers all released pretty substantial exploit mitigations. Chrome released Miracle Pointer / Backup Ref Pointer, which largely made use after freeze in the browser process unexploitable. And Safari released Lockdown Mode. Along with that, many customers were switching to wanting what's called zero-click exploits, meaning bugs that a user never has to interact with. Zero-click. They don't need to click a link, answer a phone call, open a document, because they have that much more guarantee of working because you're not dependent on the user or the target doing anything. And the thing about zero clicks is they're almost always going to be in attack surfaces that aren't in the browser, because when thinking about a zero click, it's the thing that's being sent to the user's phone before they interact. So things like phone calls or messages or things like that. So finding the bugs there. It's not really your browser doing much remotely before you interact with it. So those are just two examples of how both contribute with the number going down, one sort of on the positive side and one sort of on the negative side. The other thing we noted in the 2022 year in review is bug collisions. And this becomes one of the more difficult areas that people think it should be super easy to say, who did this? Who's behind these bugs? And it's not. Especially when we're talking the commercial surveillance vendors of, think of how many parties you have at play to sort of attribute. And trademark attribution is hard, all of that stuff. You have commercial surveillance vendors selling and putting together the whole product. You have exploit brokers or exploit shops who are often selling some of the exploits to these commercial surveillance vendors to supplement the in-house development of commercial surveillance vendors. Then you have the government customers who are actually using the product against folks. And then when you add in bug collisions are where more than one person find the same vulnerability independently. So we have seen this, becoming more often across security researcher to security researcher, security researchers and attackers and attackers themselves. One of the funny anecdotes is we continue hearing little whispers and things that when each of these bugs are getting patched, a lot of the attackers don't know who was caught because running into the same bugs. So here are some examples of sort of not great, but I try to find something to put up to show bug collisions versus, sort of the discussions and hearing and things we have. Of the top left bug was in Microsoft Proxy. It was in the wild that was just patched in September. And you can see there are 5 different entities credited on those release notes. And then, of course, there would be the in the wild attacker as well. So all those folks sort of found them independently and reported it in along with the attacker. The middle one is a Chrome bug. Last Saturday, we published about a campaign in collaboration with Citizen Lab that we had found Intellexa using 0 days in Egypt to deliver predator spyware. And so we had found the iOS gotten the iOS full chain, and then we had discovered just the first step, just the initial remote code execution, which was in Chrome for Android devices. And we found it, and then found that also just a security researcher had reported it to Chrome and independently found it as well. So that's just sort of another example of all of these bug collisions that are currently happening. And here's just a funny one in the tweet of last September, Project Zero had disclosed a bug, and then another researcher being like, RIP to the feature that was there forever and nobody wanted to report because it was useful. So getting back to these numbers, hopefully you see that these numbers in this chart actually doesn't tell us much of anything at all. I forgot what I was going to say. But what we are starting to see is, 2023, 9 months in, has surpassed 2022. And while you'll just have to wait for the 2023 year in review, because we don't have a full year to really consider the analysis and what exactly is going to happen yet, we can start looking at some of the campaigns that contributed to those numbers. So in December 2022, TAG found a Veriston campaign in the UAE, Veriston being another commercial surveillance vendor. And this was the chain used for Android devices. And it was pretty wild because 6 bugs for one exploit chain. It wasn't 6 0 days, so this was towards a Samsung device, and the initial vector was through Samsung browser. Samsung browser is built on top of Chromium and tends to be a few versions behind. So while the initial RCE was 0 day, the sandbox escape was end day on Chrome, but 0 day on Samsung browser. Then there was a 0 day info leak, and then there was a bug in the Mali GPU driver, which was end day via the Mali GPU, because ARM had released a patch for it, but it was unpatched in Android. And then we had another 0 day in the kernel and another 0 day info leak in the Mali GPU driver as well. So in one campaign, finding 4 0 days across the board, these numbers, this is what we want to see. We want to see having to use lots of bugs. Preferably, we're hoping to get to, all of these having to be full 0 days, but progress, not perfection. And here's another one. This is the one we just published about in Egypt last Saturday with Citizen Lab. And so the iOS full chain was 3 bugs, and the Android we found 1. So again, via another campaign, another 4 0 days added in. So when you start to think of that, that's a good way of wanting to find more and seeing that substantial change. So I don't want this to be all negative, because actually, I think there's been a whole lot of progress in security, not even talking 10, 15, 20 years ago. I think there's been substantial progress in even just the last 2, 3, 4 years. And that's not to say that there isn't a lot of areas of opportunity for us to improve on. But think about it. All of these attackers are needing to use 0 days now. They're not able to rely on the simpler things. We're detecting them. We're disclosing them. Vendors are fixing pretty quickly, and the 7-day deadline is becoming more normal for these in-the-wild bugs, and vendors are releasing fixes. For that iOS chain, for all 3 of those bugs, Apple released all 3 of those patches in just about a week. For a Chrome bug that was patched yesterday, Chrome patched that in 2 days. That is huge progress. Could we ever imagine being there, 5 years ago, of that type of turnaround times? And we know about it, and we're able to collaborate more. So that's definitely progress. But there's also a lot we need to work on. The unpatched times, or the unpatched periods, the end days functioning as 0 days, of course. And one of the biggest things that I continue to see, and was in that year in review as well, and I've now put in, I think, 3 different year in reviews, is that we want and we think that 0 days should be this super novel capability, exploiting bugs we hadn't looked at before in bug classes, using exploit techniques we didn't even consider. But that's not the case right now. 40% of 2022's in the wild 0 days were pretty trivial variants of previously known bugs. 20% of them were previous variants of previous in the wild bugs. So one of the biggest areas of opportunity that will be a return on investment as an industry is looking at our vendors' responses to reported vulnerabilities. And because of those bug collisions I talked about, you don't just have to wait and do this for in the wild bugs. Because what are security researchers reporting to you? They're often finding the same stuff as attackers. And so can we get patches more quickly and fixes more quickly into the user's hands? Not just if you're an upstream component or downstream, but getting it faster to users. Can we make sure the root cause of bugs is actually addressed? So James Forshaw and I presented at Offensive Con in Germany about this class of Windows bugs that was reoccurringly being exploited in the wild. And what was happening is that each time they were issuing a patch, it was to break the proof of concept or exploit, not actually fixing the root cause bug. So attackers could keep coming back, exploiting the same root cause bug, just sort of finding a new path to it. That's not getting to it, and that's making it way too easy to have this 0-day capability. So doing these root cause analyses, doing variant analyses, and sharing as much as possible. I also have this public in the wild RCA repository on GitHub. And when we first started doing this, people are like, no, you're giving all the details to attackers. And the number of times I've had to be like, the attackers have already exploited the bugs. They have these details. We are the ones who don't have it as defenders and need to be sharing it with them. We're not giving them new information. They already exploited it. But making it easier on us on all of these highly under-resourced security teams. Because none of what I'm saying is novel or not what security vendor teams have been saying over and over and over for years. I'm just trying to reiterate what they're saying. So how can we capitalize on each reported vulnerability to learn as much as possible and make it that much harder for them to come back and do it again? That's all I got. Thank you so much for having me.
What a great presentation. Do we have any questions for Maddie in the audience? You've got to wave your hands really vigorously. One over here.
Oh, there's one over here too.
Hello. Hi, Maddie. Just curious, with raising the cost of developing an exploit, do you have any concerns that attackers will start moving to the source, such as contributing weakening patches to the kernel rather than attempting to write custom exploits?
Sure. But the goal, as I said, is to continue raising the bar. If they're going to put themselves at that risk, that's another new risk of they're starting to try and interact, and more risk of getting caught than just being able to look at code and do a 0-day. So that's the goal, is to continue making it that much harder. So let's see them, try to create weakening patches and then catch them.
Any other questions?
Oh, over there. Fog.
Just on the microphone.
You're good. You're good.
Hello. There we go. Thanks for a great talk. I suppose I was just wondering, you mentioned a few different commercial surveillance vendors. I was just curious, roughly, how many kind of do you guys track or are on your radar that you sort of know about and spot them?
We're tracking between 30 and 40.
Any other questions in the audience? One over here.
Hi, Maddie. Thank you so much for your great talk. You mentioned in the talk, you mentioned the cost for various exploit chains provided by these attackers. And obviously, like, the price at which they pay is based on demand and not supply, and I get all of that. But on the defensive side, what would you say is the defensive cost of having, like, teams such as Project Zero, and on the defensive side, what's the cost of finding these vulnerabilities and patching them? Is it more? Is it less? Is it a losing battle? Is it a winning battle? What are your thoughts?
I'm not an economist, and I did not do well in, Economy 101. I mean, it's hard. Thankfully, Google pays myself and other people on Project Zero, I think, pretty decently. So I don't think we're especially cheap. But I do think, especially with the cadence that we are finding in the wild 0 days, I believe we are beating them out for what they're paying for. I mean, of course, they're guaranteeing it at this yearly rate. I think we are seeing more folks popping up in these sort of exploit dev shops and brokers because the CSVs themselves are not being able to maybe keep up or confident they can keep up in the cadence of 0 days they need to have on a regular basis, like supplementing, because they also have their own vuln researchers and exploit devs. So I know it's a unsatisfying response. I get always asked cost, and I'm like, I don't know. I know it's, it has to be more than what all of the vendors are able to pay, and their prices still keep going up for what bounties? Because I can't imagine that researchers are selling to these other shops when there's the much lower risk of giving it to a bug bounty for, you know, a pretty substantial amount of money as well.
I'm sure we could ask Maddie a million more questions, but we might have to call it there. I'm sure Maddie will be around at the conference, and talk to her if you can. And let's welcome Maddie. Thank you. Thanks, Maddie, one more time.
Thank y'all.